There's a version of you that wakes up at 3 a.m., convinced it has already failed at life. There's another version that walks into a room and quietly believes it is the most important person there. One version of you gives everything away until there's nothing left. Another version hoards its emotions like emergency supplies it never plans to use. You have a version that runs from conflict, and another that secretly starts it. One that performs joy, and one that sits in a darkened room wondering why the performance feels so exhausting. You are not one person. You never were. And the sooner you stop trying to be, the sooner you'll understand what has been quietly running and ruining your life. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who broke from Freud and spent the rest of his life mapping the inner universe of the human psyche, called these competing inner forces archetypes. He wasn't using the word loosely, the way we throw it around today to describe a type of character in a Netflix show. For Jung, archetypes were something far more ancient and structurally real. Primordial patterns embedded in what he called the collective unconscious, the deep psychological substrate that every human being shares, regardless of culture, era, or language. These aren't things you choose. They are things that were already inside you when you arrived. The concept has survived 100 years of academic scrutiny, neuroscientific revision, and pop psychology reduction because it keeps proving itself true in lived experience. Not as a system, not as a personality quiz you take on a Sunday afternoon, but as a felt encounter the moment you recognize, with a nauseating clarity, that you have once again done that thing you promised yourself you would never do again. The archetype was driving. You were just sitting in the passenger seat, thinking you were steering. This is where most content about archetypes gets it wrong. The YouTube videos, the Medium articles, the Twitter threads, they turn Jung's living, breathing, terrifying framework into a cozy self-help category. They tell you which archetype you are, and then they stop there, leaving you with a flattering label, and nothing changed. You walk away thinking you are a hero, or a sage, or a lover, and you feel seen. And then you go back to the exact same patterns that were quietly hollowing you out before you pressed play. The label becomes another identity accessory, worn alongside your Enneagram number and your MBTI letters, none of which seem to stop you from repeating the same arguments with your partner, the same self-sabotage at work, the same midnight spiral of wondering whether any of it means anything. What Jung actually understood and what the therapeutic tradition he launched has continued to develop for a century is that archetypes are not categories. They are forces. They have energy, momentum, and shadow sides. They can liberate you, or they can consume you. They operate whether you are aware of them or not, and that is precisely the problem. An archetype you haven't examined doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It runs its programs in the dark. There are 7 archetypes that psychological and mythological research identifies as the most universally active in the modern Western. Psyche, particularly in the lives of Americans and Europeans under 40, who have grown up inside a cultural pressure cooker of social media identity performance. Economic instability, fractured family structures, and a lingering pandemic-era grief that no one quite had language for. These 7 are not the only archetypes that exist, but they are the ones most likely, right now, in this moment in history, to be running your internal life without your permission. And one of them, the one you least suspect, may be the source of every pattern in your life you cannot explain. The first is the hero. You know this one. You've been told your whole life to be this one. The hero is the part of you that rises, that persists, that accepts suffering as the cost of becoming. Psychologically, the hero archetype carries the energy of agency, discipline, and the refusal to be defined by circumstance. In its healthiest expression, the hero is the inner voice that says, "Get up when you would rather stay down." That inner voice has genuine value. It has probably saved your life at least once, or saved you from a version of your life you would have regretted. But the hero has a shadow, and the shadow of the hero is the part that cannot stop. The part that turns every relationship into a mission, every rest into a failure, every ordinary Tuesday into evidence that you are falling behind. The shadow hero is the person who cannot receive help, because receiving help would mean admitting they are not the protagonist of a story that requires them to be unbreakable. It is the person who achieves enormously and feels nothing, because the achievement was never really the point. The striving was the point. The movement was the point, and now that the destination has been reached, there is only the disquieting silence where the meaning was supposed to be. Research consistently shows that burnout among under 40 Americans and Europeans has reached crisis proportions, and much of it traces back not to laziness or weakness, but to a hero archetype running so hot and so long that the person inside it has forgotten they were allowed to be a person at all. The second archetype is the caregiver, and this one operates with enormous psychological stealth because it wears the costume of virtue. The caregiver is the part of you that loves, nurtures, shows up, and gives. In its healthy form, it is one of the most beautiful forces in the human interior, the capacity for genuine, selfless attention to another person's need. It is the thing that makes someone a great parent, a loyal friend, the colleague who notices when someone is struggling before they say a word. But the shadow giver is something far more complicated. It is the person who cannot say no, not because they don't want to, but because somewhere deep in their psychological architecture, they have fused their worth with their usefulness. Their love contains a hidden contract. I will give you everything. In return, you will need me. And as long as you need me, I will know I matter. The shadow caregiver gives to control. It rescues to avoid being alone. It stays in relationships that are exhausting or even corrosive, because walking away would require answering a question it is not ready to face. Who am I when I am not needed by someone? This archetype is disproportionately active among millennials, who grew up in emotionally chaotic households and learned early that love was something you had to earn by being helpful enough, quiet enough, good enough. It is also disproportionately present in a generation now in their late 20s and 30s who have discovered that a lifetime of giving without receiving has produced a particular flavor of resentment, quiet, heavy, and aimed mostly at themselves. The third archetype lurking in the psyche is the orphan, not in the literal sense, though sometimes literally, but in the profound psychological sense of the person who expects to be abandoned, who has built an entire inner life around the foundational wound of not being held, not being chosen, not being enough. The orphan is the part of you that waits for the other shoe to drop in every relationship. That self-sabotages good things, because good things don't last, and it would rather be the one who leaves than the one who gets left. That finds evidence everywhere in a delayed text, in a colleague's neutral expression, in a partner's distracted silence that confirms the original wound. You are alone, and you always will be. What makes the orphan archetype so quietly devastating is that it masquerades as realism. It tells you it is simply paying attention to the evidence. It calls itself self-protection. It uses the language of boundaries while actually building walls. And because it has been right before, because there was an abandonment, a betrayal, a moment when the person who was supposed to hold you let go, it carries a credibility. It makes it nearly impossible to challenge. The fourth is the warrior. And here is where it gets important to distinguish it from the hero. The hero is motivated by purpose, by a story, a mission, a why. The warrior, in its psychological sense, is motivated by opposition, by the enemy, by the fight itself. The warrior's defining question is not what am I building, but what am I against? In healthy expression, the warrior is the part of you that establishes boundaries with ferocity, that protects what matters without apology, that refuses to be diminished in its shadow. The warrior becomes the part of you that cannot exist without conflict, that turns dinner conversations into debates, feedback into attacks, silence into threat, that is so alert to disrespect, to any signal that it is being underestimated, dismissed, or controlled, that it finds it everywhere, even in well-meaning gestures. The shadow warrior is disproportionately active in men under 40, who absorbed a cultural script about masculinity that equated softness with weakness. But it shows up across all genders in anyone who learned that. Tenderness was dangerous, and aggression was the only form of self-expression that felt safe. The fifth archetype is the one that the self-help industry almost never talks about honestly, because it is the one most likely to be sitting in the audience of self-help content, nodding along, taking notes, feeling temporarily transformed, and then returning with remarkable precision to exactly where it started. This is the seeker. The seeker is the part of you that is always looking, always curious, always reaching, always convinced that the answer is one book, one retreat, one relationship, one city, one career pivot away from being finally, permanently found. In its highest and healthiest expression, the seeker is one of the most luminous forces in the human interior. It is the archetype of genuine philosophical hunger, of the person who will not accept inherited answers, who insists on direct experience, who pushes at the edges of what is known. Every great mystic, every original thinker, every person who ever left the safe harbor of consensus reality to find something truer, they were driven by the seeker. But here is what the seeker's shadow does, and it does it so elegantly that most people never catch it. It converts the search itself into the destination. It makes the movement feel like the meaning. You have met this person. You may be this person. They have done the trauma therapy and the breath work and the microdosing and the silent retreat. And they are currently reading about internal family systems and planning a solo trip to Japan, and they feel, in every moment of seeking, genuinely alive, and then they stop. And the aliveness drains away, and they have to find the next thing. Because the stillness is unbearable, and the stillness is unbearable. Because it is in the stillness that the seeker's deepest fear surfaces. What if I search my entire life and find that there was nothing to find? What if I am already here, and here's not enough? This is the archetype that is most powerfully activated by the specific cultural conditions of being under 40 in North America and Europe right now. Research consistently shows that this generation is characterized by an unprecedented breadth of options and an unprecedented difficulty committing to any of them in relationships, in careers and belief systems, in identity itself. The infinite scroll is not just a design feature. It is a perfect mirror for the shadow seeker's inner life. Always one more thing. Always the possibility that what you actually need is just below the next fold. The sixth archetype is the magician. And this one requires a moment, because it is the most misunderstood of the seven. Pop psychology has turned the magician into something glamorous, something associated with manifestation and charisma and the power to transform reality through intention. That is the costume. Underneath the costume is something far more psychologically precise. The magician, in Jungian terms, is the archetype of transformation itself, the part of the psyche that understands that reality is not fixed, that perception shapes experience. The story you tell about what is happening to you is not a neutral report, but an act of creation. In its highest form, the magician is the therapist who holds a frame of healing so steady that a patient begins to believe healing is possible. It is the leader who can see the potential in a situation that everyone else has written off. It is the artist who transmutes pain into something that makes other people feel less alone. The shadow magician, however, is the part that uses this same power of framing and perception not for transformation but for manipulation. The shadow magician is the one who can make almost anything sound like almost anything. Who can construct an argument so internally coherent, so emotionally compelling, so narratively satisfying, that both they and everyone around them can be temporarily convinced of things that are not true. The shadow magician lies, but more dangerously, it lies to itself first. It is the person who intellectualizes their avoidance as spiritual wisdom, who reframes their cowardice as strategic patience, who tells a story about their life in which they are always the misunderstood, visionary, and never the person who simply didn't follow through. This archetype shows up with striking frequency in people who are highly intelligent and highly verbal. People who have always been told they are perceptive, insightful, ahead of the curve. The shadow magician weaponizes that intelligence. It uses understanding as a defense against actually changing. You can recognize it in yourself when you notice. that you are more fluent in the language of personal growth than in the actual experience of it when you can explain your patterns to a therapist with extraordinary clarity and then go home and repeat them with extraordinary fidelity. And now we arrive at the seventh, the one that is statistically and clinically most likely to be the archetype that is quietly destroying your life right now, not because it is the darkest, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most invisible. This is the ruler. Not the ruler in the sense of the powerful executive, the domineering personality, the person who needs to control every room they walk into. That is the obvious face of this archetype, and most people reading this have already decided it doesn't apply to them. They are not controlling. They are not domineering. They are, if anything, too unassuming, too accommodating, too prone to shrinking, and that is precisely the trap. Because the shadow ruler is not primarily about controlling others. It is about the desperate, consuming, exhausting need to control meaning, to control the narrative, to control how things are interpreted, to control outcomes so thoroughly that uncertainty, genuine, open, unresolved uncertainty, becomes existentially unbearable. The shadow ruler is the part of you that cannot tolerate not knowing. That fills the silence in relationships with assumptions because the silence feels more dangerous than a wrong answer. That overprepares, over-explains, over-engineers every interaction as a hedge against the terrifying possibility that something might happen that you cannot manage. Consider how this manifests in people. It's under 40 right now. In this specific cultural moment, you grew up in a world that was supposed to be optimizable. Your parents told you that if you followed the right steps, the right school, the right grades, the right internship, the right LinkedIn profile, life would arrange itself into something manageable. Then you graduated into a financial crisis or a pandemic, or an economy in which the rulebook your generation was handed has turned out to apply to a world that no longer exists. The response to that loss of external order is often a ferocious doubling down on internal control. If the world cannot be made predictable, then at least the self can be. At least the story can be managed. At least the image can be curated. At least the feelings can be organized into the appropriate containers, and the relationships can be conducted according to a script detailed enough to prevent surprise. The shadow ruler is why so many thoughtful, self-aware people under 40 are simultaneously the most psychologically literate generation in history and the most chronically anxious. Because literacy without surrender is just a more sophisticated cage. You can know the name of every cognitive distortion. You can understand your attachment style down to its neurological roots. And the shadow ruler will take all of that knowledge and use it to build a more elaborate system of control over your emotions, over your relationships, over your self-presentation, over the story of who you are and what you deserve and what is happening to you. The knowledge becomes the new weapon of management rather than the beginning of release. Here is what Jung understood that most modern psychology still struggles to fully reckon with. The archetype that is destroying you is almost never the one you are most afraid of. It is the one that has convinced you it is keeping you safe. The hero who cannot rest has convinced herself that stopping means dying. The caregiver who cannot receive has convinced himself that his needs are an imposition. The orphan who cannot trust has convinced themselves that this is just clear-eyed realism. The warrior who cannot soften has convinced himself that tenderness is a liability. The seeker who cannot arrive has convinced themselves that the search is the point. The magician who cannot be honest has convinced themselves that their narrative is truth. And the ruler who cannot release control has convinced themselves that their vigilance is the only thing standing between them and catastrophe. The shadow does not announce itself. It does not come with sirens and warning labels. It comes disguised as your most reasonable self, speaking in your own voice, using your own history as justification, arriving precisely when you are most vulnerable with exactly the argument most likely to convince you. Jung called this the autonomous complex, the part of the psyche that operates with its own agenda, its own energy, its own momentum, independent of your conscious intentions. You don't decide to act from the shadow. The shadow decides, and you experience it afterward as a choice you somehow already made. This is why the standard approach to self-improvement is the one that dominates most YouTube content. Most podcast advice, most best-selling frameworks, tends to fail at the deepest level. It addresses behavior while leaving the archetype untouched. It tells you to build better habits without examining the inner figure that keeps dismantling them. It offers strategies to the conscious mind, while the unconscious runs the real program underneath. You can optimize your morning routine, track your habits in 14 different apps, read every book about the psychology of change, and if the archetype running your shadow has not been seen, named, and engaged with directly, it will wait you out. It has infinite patience. It has been there longer than your best intentions. It is older than your most sophisticated understanding of yourself. And here is something that most content will not tell you. Because it disrupts the clean arc of the transformation narrative, you cannot eliminate an archetype. You cannot excise the shadow ruler or heal the orphan out of existence. Integration, the word Jung used for this process, and he chose it carefully, does not mean destruction. It means making the unconscious conscious. It means developing a relationship with the archetype rather than being possessed by it. The shadow ruler doesn't need to be annihilated. It needs to be in dialogue with the part of you that knows how to surrender. The shadow caregiver doesn't need to be shamed into silence. It needs to be in conversation with the part of you that knows your needs are real and your presence matters independent of your usefulness. This distinction is not semantic. It is the entire difference between self-improvement as another form of self-rejection and self-knowledge. As the beginning of something that actually feels like freedom, there is a moment that almost everyone who has done serious psychological work can point to, not as a memory of achievement, but as a memory of recognition. It is the moment when you catch the archetype in the act. Not retrospectively, not in a therapy session 2 weeks later, but in the moment itself, the hand already reaching for the phone to send the message you know you shouldn't send. The voice already constructing the justification. The body already halfway into the familiar pattern, and something in you, something new and quiet and surprisingly steady, simply sees it, not with judgment. Not with the crashing shame that usually follows self-recognition of this kind. Just with a clear, almost impersonal awareness, there it is. There is the orphan, preparing to push someone away before they can leave. There is the shadow ruler, building a case for why controlling this situation is the only responsible thing to do. That moment of seeing is the beginning of integration, and it is not dramatic. That is perhaps the most important thing to say about it. Because we have all been trained by the content we consume to expect transformation to feel like a revelation, a breakthrough session, a single conversation in which the wound is finally named and something permanently shifts. Those moments happen, but they are not the architecture of change. They are the punctuation. The actual architecture is built in the unremarkable, repetitive, unglamorous practice of noticing again and again which inner figure has taken the wheel, and gently, without war, returning your hands to it. What makes this generation uniquely positioned for this work is something genuinely new in human history. You have grown up with unprecedented access to the language of psychology, attachment theory, shadow work, nervous system regulation. These are no longer exotic clinical specialties. They are the common currency of a generation trying with real sincerity to understand themselves. Roughly 65% of Gen Z report mental health challenges, not because this generation is more broken than previous ones, but because it is more willing to look directly at what is breaking. That willingness is the same willingness Jung identified as the precondition for genuine psychological work. The courage to see what is actually there. Content grip but psychological literacy carries its own shadow, and it is worth naming directly. The shadow of knowing the language of growth is using it as a substitute for the experience of growth. You can recognize this in yourself when you notice the difference between explaining your pattern and sitting with your pattern. Explanation produces something, a sentence, a framework, an insight that can be shared. Sitting with something simply requires you to be present with what is actually happening in the body, without converting it into understanding. That quality of presence is precisely what the shadow magician and the shadow ruler most reliably interrupt. They will always offer you a better story before they allow you to feel the actual thing. The research on what produces lasting psychological change points consistently towards something that feels anticlimactic. Repetition without performance. Not the dramatic breakthrough, but the quiet return. The neural pathways that constitute an archetypal pattern, the orphan's withdrawal. The hero's compulsive striving, the caregiver's self-erasure, were built through repetition. They are not dismantled through insight alone. They are rerouted through new repetition. Through choosing differently, not once in a moment of clarity, but 1,000 times. Many of them in moments of exhaustion, when the old path is so much more familiar than the new one. Each shadow archetype has a specific counterbalancing quality. The shadow hero, the one who cannot stop, is not healed by being told to rest. It is met by the cultivated capacity for receiving, for allowing something good to arrive without having earned it. The shadow caregiver is not healed by learning to say no. It is met by developing a genuine relationship with one's own need, learning that wanting something does not make you a burden. The shadow orphan is met not by finding someone who won't leave, but by the practice of staying present with the self, present in relationships, through the discomfort that always precedes genuine intimacy. The shadow warrior finds its counterpart not in passivity, but in discernment, distinguishing between genuine threat and the ordinary friction of imperfect human contact. The shadow seeker is met by the radical, countercultural act of arriving, staying in the practice, the relationship, the quiet room, long enough to discover that the silence it was fleeing was not emptiness, but depth. The shadow magician is met by literal, unadorned truth, what you actually feel, stripped of the narrative that makes it more bearable. And the shadow ruler is met by surrender, not resignation, but the active, chosen release of the need to know how something will turn out before allowing yourself to be in it. This is not a comfortable process, and describing it as comfortable would be a form of the very dishonesty we are trying to move beyond. Genuine integration tends to involve a period of destabilization. Jung called it the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution before the new form can emerge. That discomfort is real, and it deserves to be honored rather than bypassed. One of the most consistent weaknesses in how psychological content circulates in digital spaces is the pressure toward resolution. The algorithm rewards completion. The audience expects that by the time the content ends, the wound will have been named and something will have been resolved. But the psyche does not operate on content timelines. The shadow archetype that has been running since childhood does not yield to a single sitting. It yields, if it yields, to sustained attention, to the willingness to return, again and again, to the same uncomfortable interior territory without demanding that it finally makes sense. The 7 archetypes living inside your mind are not your enemies. They are not pathologies. They are the most ancient human patterns encoded in your nervous system, expressed through your personality, animated by your specific history. What they are, each of them, is incomplete without the conscious relationship that makes their energy available rather than automatic. The one that is destroying you is not destroying you because it is evil. It is doing so because it is alone, cut off from your awareness, running its program in the dark, still trying to solve the original problem using the only logic it was given at the moment the wound first formed. It is, in the deepest sense, still trying to protect you. The work begins with the simplest possible act. You notice which archetype just drove. You don't punish it. You don't perform gratitude toward it. You simply notice. You say, internally, with as little drama as possible, there you are. And in that moment of seeing, something shifts. Not everything. Not permanently. Not in a way that makes a satisfying ending. But the light has entered. And what the light touches, Jung knew this. And the century of clinical work that followed him has confirmed it, cannot remain exactly as it was in the dark. You are not one person. You never were. And the most important relationship you will ever build is the one you are just beginning to have with all the versions of yourself that have been waiting in the unlit rooms of your interior life for you to finally come looking.